The time for Benjamin Alberti, who is professor of anthropology at Farmingham State University and lectures at the Universidad Nacional de Córdoba, Argentina. He is editor of Archaeology After Interpretation with Andrew Jones and Joshua Pollard. Also, it's editor of a special section of the Cambridge Archaeological Journal on animating archaeology of subjects, objects, and alternative ontologies, together with Tamara Bray, and editor of Latin American Archaeology with Gustavo Politis, an Argentinian archaeologist. Currently, he is researching anthropomorphism and notions of materiality in northwest Argentina and ontologies of rock art in northern New Mexico. So, Benjamin, sorry.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you to the organisers, to Chris and to Tim for the kind invitation to participate in these 2 days of intense discussion. Thank you for my colleagues with whom I've been discussing for the last 2 days with lots of things to think about. And thank you, of course, to the British Academy for funding your project. I don't study ice or concrete. I study ceramics and rock art. Both are strong candidates for solidity, for hardness. But is it also possible to think of them as the materials that in their histories and properties defy any opposition between hardness and softness, in keeping with the aims of the project? And what I will do is retroject the idea of the Anthropocene as the epoch in which humans and non-humans are inextricably entwined as a model for thinking about all past relationships between humans and materials. And I also reverse the scale. People have been talking at very grand scales. I'm going to be talking at a much smaller scale. Rock art sites are scattered in and immediately around the gorge of the Rio Grande in northern New Mexico. They have pooled up around visually striking geological formations, which have emerged as focal points within the broader landscape. Kissing Fish, for example, is a spectacular rock art site. It occupies a gully on the west rim of the gorge. This location drew archaic foragers, then ancestral Pueblo travelers, then Comanche, Apache nomads on horseback, Spanish and Anglo-American settlers, and now archaeologists. Images produced by all these visitors, excepting the archaeologists, of course, have been left behind on the rock walls of this narrow side canyon. The archaic imagery is the first, the earliest. It is bedrock art. Archaic period depictions consist of animal and human prints, geometric forms, squiggles, dots, and grid-like patterns. When facing this art, we are faced with a failure of interpretation. The geometric offers us no clues to its meaning, and the animal and human prints point weakly as indexical signs to some generalized concern with animal life. Anthropomorphic pots from the La Candelaria culture of 1st millennium AD northwest Argentina are dispersed around the Chungus, or eastern forests that mark the transition to the Chacoan lowlands. They are very rarely painted, of various sizes, and distinguished mainly by their excessive modelled forms, incised decoration, and almost grotesque character. There are some recognisable classes and repeated themes: asymmetry, the combination of body parts of disparate origin, human, bird, animal, frog, biomorphism, and the repetition of features such as the ubiquitous bulge form. Again, interpretation is rarely attempted. I have a question about meaning. I put this question to Tim Ingold 5 years ago in an email sent from a bus travelling at night through northern Argentina. Tim had just delivered a grueling series of lectures at the Universidad Nacional de Córdoba, Argentina, that I had attended. I have a feeling he was also on a bus travelling at night from Argentina to Chile, if I remember correctly. Irritatingly, I can't find the original email, but my question was to do with the anthropomorphic ceramics I study. It went something like this. How do you understand specific form and the anthropomorphism from a making perspective? That is, how do I, as an archaeologist, incorporate meaning into my account of these pots without imagining this meaning as imposed from without by a meaning-giving subject? The image that remains of Tim's response is that of hands shaping, working clay moving, and of a form emerging, accommodating itself to the dimensions and movements of the hands, which pinched, smoothed, moulded the clay, nurtured it into shape. His response reminded me of his paper on the Acheulean hand axes, the remarkable similarity in form of these Paleolithic artifacts being a consequence of the shape of the hand, not a cultural design. I was tantalized by his response, but doubts lingered. Yes, I thought, but that is true of any anthropomorphic pottery. What about my pottery? How do we move from form to explanation of what is traditionally called the decorative elements? That is, what about meaning? My intention, therefore, is to understand meanings as emerging from the processes of making. It is to think about the decorative elements as a case of making. The rock art and ceramics serve to extend my theoretical discussion. Much information has been collected by ethnographers on the meanings associated with pottery design. Parallels are drawn with many other domains of life. Rock art has been more commonly isolated as pure imagery. Meanings are most often applied to the pot or art. So I will follow this in the company of work by Tim Ingold and also by feminist physicist Karen Barad, who Chris mentioned. To preempt my conclusions, I argue that ceramics and rock art involve specific gestural histories. It is in these gestures that meaning resides. Ingold's reference to hands when asked about meaning was not entirely surprising. There are other tantalizing references in his work that touch on the relationship between meaning or the social and making. In his hugely influential paper, The Temporality of the Landscape, he argued that meaning is not lain over the world, rather, stories open up worlds. To quote, "Meaning is there to be discovered in the landscape if only we know how to attend to it." In his study of ground, Tim Ingold also describes this as a domain in which the lives and minds of humans and non-humans are tied together. Knowledge, he writes, becomes social when it percolates the ground, tangling with the trails of other beings. So the sense one gets from this and other references is the refusal to separate what we might call meaning or the social from practices, goings-on, life. That, after all, is the project, to not succumb to the separation of matter from meaning. Meanings, ideas, culture, these have to surge up or emerge from the processes of life. Physicist and feminist Karen Barad is increasingly popular in archaeology and elsewhere. It is easy to see why. Her focus is exactly on the relationship between meaning and matter, how ideas in the physical world emerge together. Barad seems to offer a way to think about the specific mechanism that produces this closeness. In her theory, ontological difference is an achievement and not pre-given. This notion of ontological unity is very important. It means that material things and meanings cannot be treated as separate. They are equally real and share the same status. Ingold writes similarly of knots and knotting. Though he avoids mentioning meaning, the types of things that knotted into knots, or emergent outcomes as he calls them, are flows, growth patterns, bodily movements and gestures, sensory perception, among other things. These are all on a par ontologically. None is more fundamental or more derivative. Ontological difference exists then, but cannot be determined in advance. It is non-essential. In Barad's case, ontological difference, specific things, are an outcome of the coming together of meaning and matter through practice. For Ingold, they are the knots that are new forms, the emergent outcomes of forces of tension and friction. Practice is the key. It is performative, that is, ontologically generative. To attempt to explain, in even the most recent theorizing on materiality in archaeology, an essentialist notion of matter is retained. The idea of material agency is indicative. In this idea, which I don't subscribe to, just to get that clear, discourse and matter are seen as ontologically prior to practice. They are separate and prior. They influence one another only through practice. But the relationship is not equal. Matter can strongly influence practice. Think of biological sex or the physical properties of ceramics. And while discourse strongly influences practice, it only weakly influences matter via practice. Matter is thus plastic, bodies, clay, but its essential nature is unchanged by discourse or practice. Barad sees this as a problem. Her solution is to change the status of practice. She makes practice prior to both meaning and matter. Matter and discourse are mutually and performatively produced through practices. That's the general picture. I find two related ideas that Barad comes up with suggestive. First, Barad argues that meanings are internally and locally produced out of a state of indeterminacy. This bit's a little bit abstract, just to let you know, so you've got to focus for a little bit, okay? Next 5 minutes, a bit hard. First, he argues that meanings are internally and locally produced out of a state of indeterminacy. That is, determinate meanings and states of matter are together the outcome of internal processes of differentiation. Prior to this, things have no specific material state or meaning. There is a kind of background sea of indeterminacy. Barad uses the term interaction to describe how things then come into determinacy, how matter and meaning coalesce into specific states with clear meanings and physical properties. Interaction, importantly, is not interaction. Interaction suggests the coming together of pre-existing things to create a new thing. Intra-actions are internal. When an event occurs within this sea of indeterminacy, a cut is made. That cut separates out specific things and establishes their boundaries. Things can only exist in that form and with those properties in relation to one another. These things, or objects and subjects in Barad's vocabulary, can be likened to the knots that Ingold refers to. They are the temporary congealing of stable things. Barad calls these things in relation, she calls them phenomena. The second idea I find suggestive from Barad is that specific material arrangements embody specific concepts. A famous example is that of the experimental apparatus used to determine whether electrons have a wave or a particle state, and this is the same experiment that Chris referred to. The two states, wave and particle, are mutually exclusive, but small adjustments to the apparatus can produce one or other state. Barad's point is that the concept of wave or particle is embodied by the experimental apparatus. There is a tight relationship. This example also illustrates an important point Barad makes. Attributes or properties are not intrinsic to individuals or objects. The proper referent is the phenomenon, and here I would include meaning as a property or attribute of the entire phenomenon. So the 2 points that I would take from Ingold and from Barad are thus: 1, there are no predetermined ontological states. These are achievements. And second, determinate states of meaning and matter, these achievements, are internal to emergent phenomena or knots. But I think both Ingold and Barad leave a question mark when trying to get meanings from things. Barad's work is most successful when its target is scientific concepts embodied by specific apparatuses in experimental conditions. And Ingold is clear on emergent forms, but relatively silent about how meaning might emerge in specific instances. He might correct me. Here's a concrete archaeological example, which has nothing to do with my own material. Chantal Connelly has shown convincingly that the properties of materials and their relationships to form only ever emerge relationally. People's understandings of their worlds guide their technological choices, which, in turn, impact the properties that can exist for them. She uses the example of Middle Magdalenian contours découpés from the Pyrenees. The contours découpés are pendants carved predominantly into the shape of horses' heads and made from the hyoid bone of horses. The form is suggested by the materials. Importantly, however, this is only the case for people who know how to see it. These are people who had the specialized knowledge earned through practice, in this case of predation and butchery. Practices produce specific knowledge of materials, and the form and content of the imagery is thus tightly connected to the tools, techniques, and materials. This example hints at how the determinacy of matter and meaning might be achieved through practice. The knowledge that went into the making of the pendant came out of a long tradition of practices of horse butchery. Now, if we free the rock art from its grave stillness, we can see that there is a lot more going on. So let us expand the limits of the phenomenon, rock art, and return again to this scene. In the marking of rock are combined generative processes that occurred over the course of millennia. But these are not solely human-authored. These basalt boulders have been slowly worked upon by complex ecologies, weather, sun, water, microbial life and lichen, as well as the movements of peoples and animals. The indigenous rock artists participated in the ecological transformation of these surfaces, when they pecked, scratched, and ground into the patina to produce the images. I've said these images are problematic for archaeologists. They are not in any obvious way pictures of archaic life. If one steps back, however, from a singular attention to the imagery itself, it is possible to begin to see the range of processes in which the rock art participates: movement, water, lichen, microbes. These are itinerant marks made by peoples conditioned by movement and with a knowledge as deep as the Magdalenians' knowledge of the horse. Movement is a constant theme in the archaic imagery. Animal prints moved up and over rock surfaces, almost purposefully, though towards what is not clear. Dots march across rock faces, often in rows and frequently accompanied by lines and curves. Occasionally, they follow the movement of the rock face as it shears. The rock art is also strongly associated with confluences of water. Kissing Fish, the name of the site, is in fact a drainage that has cut a sharp notch in the rim of the gorge, which spring snowmelt sometimes transforms into a spectacular waterfall. This is not a common event. The basalt rock on the rim's edge is carved up by the action of water. Runoff leaves mineral deposits and staining, and much more transitorily, passing rain patterns and transforms rock surfaces. The imagery responds to the watery theme. Dots and miniature cupules recall the action of water on the areas around the drip line of overhangs, or the concavities produced by pebbles and torrents, as well as natural rock pools. The matter of water and stone is replaced by that of soft ground in the case of the footprints of deer, birds, and humans that sink into and over the rock faces. The rock art shares surfaces with other signs of life. Casting our eye or hand across the surface, we come across colours and textures. Most apparently, these are the dry or slightly furry surfaces of lichen, crustose or folios, ancient, slow co-inhabitants. The rock art itself would originally have been vibrant as quartzite hammerstones broke through the desert varnish that covers these rocks, a surface effect produced by the combined actions of microbes, airborne oxides, and clay baked by the sun. Lichen colonies, microbial and fungal life worked on rock surfaces in different ways, producing either slow-moving patterns of various hues and textures, or extensive swathes of darkened or coloured areas. Algae and fungi produced brilliant lichen colonies that expand in patterned formations and eventually themselves eat away rock faces altogether. They alter the surface, quickening the decay of rock rind, or leave stains, permanent discoloration. The patterning of lichen and its slow growth brings to mind the form and patterning of the rock art itself. In fact, distinguishing time-worn rock art from time-worn lichen is a challenging task. So here we see life, art, human, non-human, cause, source, model and intention utterly jumbled in a sort of compost of agencies. Clay is dug from pits or riverbanks. Where it comes from will determine what else comes with it beside the clay minerals. It might need to be cleaned to remove unwanted materials, then tempered to add material to produce particular effects, stability when fired, stubbornness if dropped. Potting is a multi-sensory activity. Experienced potters feel for the correct texture of materials, and they do this to reach the desired ratio of clay, temper, and water. A bitter taste to the clay may reveal the presence of salts. The experience of sourcing clay, pigments, and other necessary materials shows up in the appearance of the pot. For example, Andy Roddick shows how layered sediments of red and brown clay were reproduced in late formative terraco pottery from Bolivia. We can find other agencies at work too. Tiny crustaceans bring sediment to the surface and so alert the Tremembé Indians of the presence of red and yellow ochre that they collect and use as pigment. Human and non-humans are again hard to disentangle. Then, working with the clay, with hands, the potter bends over the pot, working quickly, pushing and pinching shapes. She slows down to carefully attach to the material already assembled, or pushes out through the wall of the pot from the inside. Tools are selected from bird or other small bones and drawn through the clay or pressed into it, changing surfaces, forming recognizable things, though edges of incised lines remain ragged, uneven. A flat, polished stone passed over the surface smooths and burnishes. To recap, what I've done so far is shift focus from matter as essential and meaning as free-floating to talk about ontologically productive practices. Practice produces matter and meaning in an essential relation. Practice is not exclusive to humans. Other things participate. Simple observations of the rock art and the process of pot making breaks down the barrier between human and non-human practices. Archaic rock art is not separate from the processes already present on, in, and around the rocks. It joins with and continues them. Similarly, the pots rely on an array of materials and skilled non-human practice alongside the human authors' ones. Likewise, there is a clear dynamism in the relationship between potter and emerging form. The emerging form influences the movement of hands. Ingold is likened forming these pots to a process of growth. He notes, and this is similar to the response he gave to me, he notes that just as human hands caressed and cradle babies, the potter's hand strokes the clay. All this handling, this nurturance, allows the form of the pot to emerge, just as does that of the growing baby. This process of anthropogenesis, as he calls it, has form as an emergent outcome. He has described this perspective as one of making in growth. Making interjects itself in general processes of growth. Events of making are like rites of passage. They, quote, ease persons and materials from one phase of life and growth to the next. A further example he provides is the making of a Trobriand Islander canoe. The builder of the canoe neither imposes a form on the wood nor grows a canoe. Instead, he brings one way of life and growth to an end in preparation for the launching of another. Form, human, pot, or rock art, is akin to growth, or making in growth. The form is made or grown, whether pot, baby, textile, or any other thing, through nurturing activity, human authored or not. The specifics of the human body guide the outcome of work. So, pause. Are we closer to understanding how meaning emerges from practice? I'm not sure we are. We seem to have arrived instead at form. The contour découpé, the rock art, the pots, babies, all show how form and making are intimately linked. In answer to the question of why pots look like bodies, Ingold states the following, and I quote, "If there was a likeness between artifacts and organisms, it was not because the former had been modelled in the image of the latter, but because similar processes would generate similar results." I couldn't agree more. This is actually a great description of what is going on with the rock art. But is meaning the same as form? What are the so-called decorative elements? The motifs, abstractions that seem to escape the immediacy or necessity of the form generated by these processes of making? Or is meaning derivative of form? Does perhaps form follow practice, with meaning then following form? Oh dear. So here's the troubling question in all this. Is there still an ontological gap between thing and its meaning? Have we just shifted the problem over a little? We may have successfully shown how materials and forms emerge from practice, but is there an ontological gap still between discourse and meaning on the one side and practices and materials on the other? One reason I ask is because we tend still to resort to meanings applied to the materials, laying over them. That is, actual interpretation of specific decorative elements does not often arise from the specific phenomenon we are dealing with. For example, I have made the case that bodies and pots were treated in very similar ways among the La Candelaria potters. Amazonian ethnographies instruct us that bodies needed to be worked on, marked and fed to ensure their stability as human bodies. I argued that ceramic bodies were marked in similar ways in order to stabilize them too. Following Barad, bodies, whether ceramic or flesh, were ontologically of a kind, the same. Neither was self-evident nor inherently stable. Good. I like my interpretation. But the specifics of the interpretation rely on the confluence of Barad's concept of phenomenon and the concept of chronically unstable bodies, drawn from anthropologist Aparecida Vilaça. And she develops her concept on the basis of indigenous Amazonian ideas about bodies. So, to be clear, we can understand the general principle that meanings emerge with materials through practice. But, in order to be specific about what something means, we still need concepts and meanings brought in after the fact from elsewhere. Returning to Ingold's making and growth, the description of the ontological transformation of the pots and Trobriand canoe through making are compelling examples. Form emerges in growth. It is not imposed by culture. But the problem arises when we move to the eyes. Ingold points out the eyes in both cases on the prow board of the canoe and on the pots. This is the part that seems to escape the shape of the hands and the similarities of process. My questions are, why eyes? Why here? Why precisely this design done in this way? How does this emerge from practice, from making in growth, from the materials? Unless we are fortunate enough to work within reach of appropriate ethnographies, the jumbled agencies I described for kissing fish might stay just that, a suggestive coagulation. Determinacy of material and meaning perhaps hinted at, but not achieved. Are we condemned then to add meanings borrowed from elsewhere, even if we understand that meaning is a performative and it is general, that it does in fact inhere strongly to materials? How are we to find this out by ourselves? In answer, I think we can only start with the assumption that these decorative elements are in fact what we would call maybe form plus. One could conceptualize the form and any general principle generated from that form as the ground upon which meaning grows. Meanings grow from the emergent form. In a sense, they do. But Barad's notion of embodied concept specifies that whatever meaning emerged here was a part of and consequent of the cut that delimited thing known from thing doing the knowing, subject and object in her language. That is, they must emerge through the same mechanism that form does at the same time as it does. In keeping, then, I would call these micro-gestures, the multiple marks left by deft flicks of the wrist around the neck of the ceramics, or the quick impressions that leave the distinctive coffee bean eyes and so on. That is, the elaboration of form into specific meanings would include the incisions, plastic additions, and so on. These are still carefully connected to the shape and capacity of the hands, as well as the limits of the tools. These gestures are performative too. The many micro-gestures that make up a pot in its growing are the marks that make determinate its meaning. Meaning resides and emerges out of these cuts. I want to get in close to these lines, the marks, and think about the changes they brought about. Every cut of a bird's bone in damp clay, or blow of a hammerstone. So, in conclusion, it would appear that we are too easily dazzled by our ability to abstract. A first conclusion then is this: even the most elaborate of decorative motif is non-accidental, non-abstract. And we are equally duped by the apparent solidity of things. In ceramic production, firing is considered the final and most technically challenged step. It changes the plastic clay to solid pot. Basalt is really hard. It hurts when you hit it. But add a little time and patience, and neither remains whole. Solidity then seems an entirely inappropriate way to understand the rock art or ceramics. Once the process is the focus, and gestures are given power to make form and meaning, then the properties of stone or ceramics are up for grabs. These are not necessarily hard, durable materials. They might be, sometimes, and for some things. But they might also be disaggregated. They may come into determinate existence in ways that do not support the concepts of hard or stable as part of their being. Firing pots can reveal their instability too. When these concepts do exist, they do so as repeated ontological achievements, as part of larger phenomena that condition what kind of things they are. So a second conclusion is that matter and meaning are internal to phenomena. Third and finally, I insist that the former plus elements, art, let's call it that, must obey the same mechanism as form itself. The trick is finding how the gestures of shaping, hammering, incising, and so on are not accidents added to form, but are an inherent part of its meaning and is equally involved in specific ontological achievements. Chris Simonetti and colleagues have shown how experimenting with making can produce a vocabulary that challenges the general meanings of things. In their case, describing the movements involved in making concrete and describing these movements as gestures of gathering, flattening, and curing, supports concrete's definition as liquid rock. To this end, I argue, we need to generate gestural histories and concepts that emerge from our studies of these micro-gestures. Having said all that, I have been accused by good friends and family of being too analytical. Maybe I need to stop thinking about it and do something, make something. For, as Ingold has written, to describe any material is to pose a riddle whose answer can be discovered only through observation and engagement with what there is. I expect that the riddle of meaning will be answered by tending carefully to Mark's left and to all else that is going on. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Ben. And I'm sorry I couldn't turn the lights off, so your images were clear, but not as expected. So we have some minutes for questions, comments. Let's see if they arrange these microphones. So, yeah, sure. So, first reaction.
Thanks very much, Ben. I was really interested in the connection between landscape and rock art, and also connection with water, specifically certain water sources. And my question is that whether you can draw some more connections between certain powers embedded in the landscape and water and rock art. Because in some cases we could even, hypothetically, we could even say that some specific places in certain landscape resist human attempts of opening up or resist determinism. Some places act in a way that they resist meaning in a way. And water sources might be an example of that, and there are examples throughout Amerindian, especially landscapes. So I wanted to ask you a bit more about the connection between water, landscape, and the possibility of a landscape that receives meaning in certain localities, if you will.
Thank you, Pierre Giorgio. It's a very interesting question. As far as the project goes, what we have done so far is mark the location of the rock art throughout this area, and have noted it does tend to, rock art tends to coalesce around these areas of water confluences, and rock art also begets rock art. Rock art attracts rock art to itself. I like the idea of these places it's resisting meaning, overt meanings in some sense, because the types of connections that one can see are between I'm trying to think from a kind of a process point of view, so thinking of the processes that are being followed in the creation of the rock art that may have been observed, experienced in these locations. So one of them is this carving of the rock, and I showed you one rock carving picture, but that's not actually in Kissing Fish. But on the lip of where the water falls, there are lots of channels that have been carved and pools that have been carved out by the water. So in a sense, the rock art being there is the rock art being, so rock art begets rock art, but does other kinds of natural carving processes such as water falling beget rock art, beget people doing that, attract people doing similar things as they see happening in the landscape around them. So those are, we can see iconographic similarities in terms of squiggly lines and lines of water, but I'm not sure how far I'd like to take that. But you do see cupules that are carved out naturally in the rock through the action of water and small stones, and then you see cupules in the rock art. So there is definitely a relationship, and whether it resists, these are places that resist overt meanings, that's a very interesting question. Thank you.
We have Christian here.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. I was thinking, I was reading recently about argument on both experiments and thought experiments, making a huge emphasis on the physicality of the instruments. But the instruments look very solid. She was actually pointing to the bolts that hold the panels where the light was meant to go through. But if you compare to what you have here, and I wonder about the limitations of a lab science as opposed to a field science, to the field sciences in general, because here you're talking about gestures and,
Yeah.
and meaning that grows through the gesturing or the mattering, if you want to use Barrett's language. But I'm not sure whether you see where I'm going. The hard physicality of the instrument that generates meaning in physics, following what Barrett is arguing, and what is the thing she's dealing with. It's completely far removed from the experience of actually transforming clay, where you get your hands dirty, where the instruments change as you use them. Like you could think of the same when you travel in archaeology. When you travel in archaeology, you not only change the surface of where you're traveling, you're also leaving a record of your experience in the travel, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely.
That doesn't seem to happen in the solidity of an instrument. So are we talking here about different gestures? Could we talk about gestures in that other context?
In the context of the Gedanken of the...
Or the left side?
Right, so you're absolutely right. She set up these experiments that are closely controlled, and when she says that these concepts are tightly embodied by the physical apparatus, it is within these particular settings. And there's more than the state of an electron that she talks about. She talks about position, momentum, all sorts of things that were problems. Yes, so when I'm out in the field experiencing my rock art, or when the indigenous artists were hammering away at the rock, that's not an experimental condition, and neither is making a ceramic. So what I take from Barad is the very suggestive notion of the tight connection between, as you mentioned, this critique of representationalism, so it's the collapse of that distance between meaning and concept. All right. So she, in her work, as far as I understand it, is attempting to generalize from that to enable analyses that are as tight as we can get them in terms of understanding how concepts or practice-driven, as are materials, that the two things are not incidental; they are tightly connected to one another. So by citing that example, what I want to suggest is that there is a tight connection between the meaning of the rock art and what is being done to the rock at that particular moment. And so in gestures is my own direction in terms of that's what I have to work with, and that's what I find compelling, is the practice element. So how can we think about gestures and the materiality of those gestures? You know, the language that you yourself developed in relation to concrete, how can that help us to develop new concepts, new meanings around things like rock art or ceramic production? Does that help?
Yeah, it does. But I do feel that to some extent our view of science has been taken by lab sciences. But when you think from the viewpoint of field sciences, then other things start to happen. And I wonder whether you could think the lab science from the field sciences. What would be to think of gestures? What are the gestures that could be involved in the if gesture in your argument is tied to the generation of meaning? If that is the case, if the generation of meaning is tied to how we practice knowledge, how we move in the environment, how we and as we transform our surroundings, then if that is so, then how would that apply to? My feeling is that the analysis of Barad is too much on the instrument, an instrument that is very fixed and solid.
No, absolutely, and that's her example. She has further examples in which she moves away from that, and increasingly she talks about the brittle star, which is a kind of biological organism. She talks about imaging, and she talks about the factory setting, the social relations of gender and power in a factory setting in India, using someone else's work. But those cases become increasingly, the ones that move away from this close connection with some kind of technological instrument become increasingly kind of loose and less, to my eyes, less convincing as examples. But one could incorporate, I mean, yes, you could take gestures back to the laboratory and understand it, I suppose, that way. Although I think it would Barad's explanation of what's going on in the laboratory is a powerful one, that the gesture is an element of what she's talking about. Anyway, when she talks about marks on bodies and cuts. So I'm trying to develop a kind of a language that will get at what we have in rock art or in ceramics to attempt to move, essentially moving, Tim, from your work about the formation of the pot through hands and the making in growth, and to keep going in some way so I can understand the art, right, the decorative add-ons to my pots in a way that is loyal to that same approach. Faithful is the better word, right? Because I don't want to make a distinction. If making is the ontology that we're following.
Okay, there's room for a final question. Let me ask a very quick one. What is language, oral language, a micro gesture? Because I can imagine the people who are doing this rock art, whatever, speaking, talking each other or the environment. And how does it come to your scenery?
Well, I can't hear them, unfortunately. But no, I mean, language has an important role in Barad's work, and I think, in archaeology, I've been thinking for a while that we've been dismissing language and words at our peril, because there's the material turn, which says, let's get rid of the linguistic turn and words. But I think that's the wrong way to go. We actually need to include words in what we're doing, a little like Keith Basso does in his work among the Apache, and how they talk about language, but give words much more gravity than we have, much more of a heaviness and an ontological kind of status, rather than these things that float away. So words would come, yes. I don't know about my pots, but words are important.
Okay, thank you very much. And congratulate you. Thank you, Ben.